Lee Mireille noticed the chairs first. Not the floating chandeliers made of living crystal. Not the 1,000-seat amphitheater carved from a single asteroid. Not the 600 species seated in concentric rings like the galaxy had folded itself into a room. No. She noticed that the human chairs were smaller. Not by much. Just enough to make a person shift every few minutes. Never quite settling. Never quite comfortable. The kind of small that could be called an oversight by anyone who had never sat in one for 6 hours. She had been sitting in hers for 3. The 214th Galactic Concord Summit was everything her training had promised, and nothing her body was prepared for. The air was too clean. Filtered through 7 atmospheric processors to accommodate species that breathed methane, nitrogen, and things Mireille could not spell. It left a taste like licking the inside of a hospital. The translation implant behind her ear ran hot, cycling through 9 language streams at once, turning alien vowels into flat, polite English that stripped every sentence of its teeth. She glanced at Ambassador Kang Taeho 3 seats to her left. He sat perfectly still, hands folded over a closed folder, watching the proceedings the way a man watches rain through a window. Patient. Distant. Done. Mireille had studied his file before the posting. 22 years in the Terran Navy. 14 years in diplomatic service. He had negotiated the Orion Corridor Shipping Treaty, brokered the ceasefire at Kepler 442, and once talked a Kaldrathi warship out of firing on a civilian freighter, using nothing but a comm channel and 45 minutes of silence. The file called him measured. His staff called him the Rock. The aliens called him the Agreeable One. He had not spoken once today. On the chamber floor, Emissary Theron of the Valith Dominion was entering his 2nd hour of addressing the assembly. He was tall for his species, nearly 3 meters of scaled muscle wrapped in diplomatic silk, and he spoke with the careful rhythm of someone who had rehearsed every word in front of a mirror. His resolution was on the floor. Resolution 1187. Protective restructuring of underdeveloped outer territories. Mireille had read the full text on the shuttle ride in. It took her 40 minutes and a legal dictionary. Stripped of its language, it said one thing. Humanity's outer colonies would be placed under Concord jurisdiction. Their governments dissolved. Their resources managed by a joint committee that did not include a single human member. Theron called it protection. He called it the natural evolution of interstellar cooperation. He thanked the human delegation for their decades of selfless contribution to the Concord's shared prosperity. He said it while looking directly at Taeho. Taeho did not blink. 3 rows behind Theron, Delegate Fenris of the Kaldrathi Confederation leaned back in his seat and showed his teeth. Among his species, this was amusement. He had spent the better part of 2 decades making no secret of his opinion on humanity. Soft, cooperative to the point of cowardice, useful the way a tool is useful. You don't respect a wrench, you use it. Fenris had once referred to the human delegation as the galaxy's filing clerks during a live broadcast. It trended for a week. Mireille's hands tightened in her lap. She looked at Taeho again. Still, nothing. Still that window-watching patience. Beside her, Deputy Ambassador Yoon Hana sat with one ankle crossed over the other, her datapad resting on her knee like a sleeping cat. Hana was the kind of woman whose smile made you check your pockets. Brilliant, precise. The sort of strategist who could map the emotional pressure points of an entire species over dinner and still order dessert. She had not looked up from her datapad in over an hour, but Mireille had the uncomfortable feeling that Hana was seeing everything in the room without needing to look at any of it. On Taeho's other side, military attaché Park Do-yoon sat like a piece of furniture that could kill you. He was broad, silent, and radiated the particular energy of a man who had decided long ago that words were an inefficient use of his time. His dress uniform was perfect. His face was a wall. Mireille had tried to make conversation with him on the shuttle. He had looked at her, nodded once, and gone back to staring at the bulkhead. She liked him. She did not know why. Theron finished his address. The chamber hummed with the low-frequency murmur of 100 translation systems, processing applause into species-appropriate responses. Speaker Ulverich, the ancient Ruvani who had chaired the Concorde for 90 years, raised 2 of his 4 arms for silence. His compound eyes swept the chamber with the slow precision of someone who had outlived most of the arguments in the room. "The Terran delegation may now respond," Ulverich said. This was the moment. Mireille had prepared 3 response drafts for Tejo: measured disagreement, conditional acceptance, strategic delay. 3 options, each calibrated to buy time without burning bridges. She had stayed up until 4 in the morning on them. She was proud of the conditional acceptance. It had a clause about resource auditing that she thought was genuinely clever. Tejo stood. He adjusted his cuffs, one, then the other. Slow. Mireille watched his hands, and something cold moved through her stomach. "The Terran delegation thanks the Concorde for its clarity," Tejo said. His voice was calm, warm even. The translation implant rendered it faithfully into 600 languages, and in every one of them, the sentence sounded like a compliment. He closed his folder. Hana was already on her feet, datapad tucked under her arm, her chair pushed back in a single smooth motion that said she had known this was coming before Mireille had boarded the shuttle. Dohyun rose without sound. He did not push in his chair. He did not need to make the gesture smaller than it was. Tejo turned toward the exit. Mireille sat frozen. Her 3 response drafts glowed on her screen. The conditional acceptance, the clever clause, all of it useless. She looked at Hana, who was already walking, and then at Dohyun, whose back said everything his mouth never did, and then she stood up so fast her chair scraped against the stone floor, and the sound carried across the entire chamber like a small, embarrassing gunshot. She gathered her things. Her hands were shaking. A pen rolled off the desk, and she almost dove for it before realizing that 600 species were watching her, and the pen did not matter. She followed them out. Behind her, the chamber was silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of apex predators realizes, all at once, that they have been sitting next to something they did not understand. Ulverich's compound eyes tracked the 4 humans as they crossed the floor, passed through the arched doorway, and disappeared into the corridor beyond. In 600 years of the Galactic Concorde, no delegation had ever walked out. The silence held, and held, and held. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Ulverich counted them the way his species counted everything, precisely, instinctively, the way a heart counts beats. Then the chamber broke. It did not break with shouting. It broke the way glass breaks underwater, slow at first, pressure finding cracks, and then, all at once. A Gathani delegate turned to the ambassador beside her and said something too low for translation. A Kaldrathi officer reached for his communicator. 3 Valith aides scrambled toward Theron's platform, their tails dragging on polished stone. Someone from the Pelori delegation made a sound that the translation systems rendered as, "Oh no," but which in Pelori carried roughly the same weight as a prayer. Ulverich raised all 4 arms. "Order," he said. His voice was old, but it filled the room the way water fills a glass, completely. "The Assembly will maintain order." The Assembly did not maintain order. He leaned back in his massive chair and let out a bark that his species used for mockery and combat in roughly equal measure. "The clerks have dropped their files," he said, loud enough for the nearest 50 delegations to hear. "Someone fetch them before they get lost." His military aide, a younger Kaldrathi with scars across both forearms, leaned close and pressed a datapad against Fenris's arm. Fenris glanced down. He stopped laughing. The datapad showed fleet positioning data from the Terran outer boundary. The Terran 7th Fleet, under Admiral Baek Sun-woo, had repositioned 18 hours ago. Not after the walkout, before it, before Thuron's speech, before the session opened, before the human delegation had even entered the chamber. Fenris read the timestamp 3 times. "They knew," his aide said. He stared at the empty human chairs across the chamber. The small ones, the ones pushed slightly back from the table. And for the first time in a career built on certainty, he had no idea what he was looking at. 2 levels below the chamber, in the diplomatic quarters assigned to the Terran delegation, Taeho sat alone in a room that smelled like recycled air and foreign cleaning chemicals. He had removed his jacket. It hung on the back of a chair that was, like everything else in this station, slightly too small. His hands were flat on the table. He was not reading. He was not preparing. He was sitting the way a man sits after he has pulled a pin and is waiting for the sound. Hana was in the next room, running probability models on 3 screens at once. She had built the decision tree for this moment over the course of 2 years. Every branch accounted for. Every alien response categorized by species psychology, political alignment, economic dependency. She had predicted Fenris would laugh first. She had predicted Thuron would push for a vote without human consent. She had predicted that Ulvarich would invoke Charter Protocol 9 within the hour. She was right on all 3. Mireille found Taeho in the small room. She stood in the doorway and did not know what to do with her hands. So she held the datapad against her chest like a shield. "Ambassador," she said. "Mireille, did we just start a war?" Taeho looked at her. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "We ended the slow one," he said. She did not understand. She filed it away for later, the way she filed everything she did not understand, in the part of her brain that would keep turning the words over until they made sense at 3 in the morning. Back in the chamber, Thuron was on his feet. His scales had shifted color, darker along the jaw, which in Valith body language meant either anger or fear, and it occurred to several nearby delegates that these might be the same thing. "The resolution stands," Thuron said. His voice was controlled, but his tail swept the floor behind him in tight arcs. A departing delegation does not halt the proceedings of the Concord. Ulvarich turned 2 of his 4 eyes toward Thuron. The other 2 remained fixed on the empty human seats. "Under Article 14 of the Concord Charter," he said, with the patience of someone who had been quoting rules before Thuron's grandparents were born, "a formal withdrawal by any signatory delegation triggers a 90-cycle freeze on all active resolutions pertaining to the withdrawing party's interests." Thuron's jaw tightened. "That protocol has never been invoked." "No," Ulvarich agreed. "It has not, because no delegation has ever withdrawn." The chamber processed this. 90 cycles, nearly a standard year. Thuron's resolution, his carefully built coalition, his months of back-channel deals, his leverage, frozen, not defeated, worse, suspended, left hanging in the air like a blade that could not fall. Thuron sat down. He did it slowly, the way large predators do when they realize the ground beneath them is not as solid as they believed. In the observation gallery above the chamber, Observer Lysick of the Gathani Neutral Archive sat cross-legged on a cushion designed for a body twice her size and pulled files. This was what Gathani did. They watched, they recorded, they found patterns in data the way other species found prey in grass. Lysick was young for an observer, barely 60, but she had a reputation for seeing connections that others missed. In 600 years of Concord records, 7 delegations had formally withdrawn. She pulled each file, read the circumstances, compared the data. All 7 had withdrawn from positions of weakness, collapsing economies, military defeats, internal revolutions. They withdrew because they had nothing left to bargain with. The walkout was a white flag, not a weapon. Humanity had the 3rd largest fleet in known space, the largest merchant marine, the most extensive deep space logistics network ever built. They held patents on biotech that fed 12 species. Their engineers maintained navigation systems across 4 galactic arms. They had not walked out because they were weak. Lysic's hands, small, damp, built for precision, began to tremble. She pulled another file, Economic Dependency Analysis. She had to build it herself, because no one had ever thought to ask the question, what happens if humans stop participating? Trade routes, medical supply chains, agricultural shipments, hazard navigation protocols, communication relay maintenance. Each number was small on its own. Together, they described a web so vast and so deeply woven into the Concord's daily operations that removing it would be like pulling thread from a living body. The humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest or the most advanced, but they were the most embedded. They had spent 40 years making themselves essential in ways that nobody had bothered to measure, because nobody had imagined they would stop. Lysic sat back. The cushion swallowed her small frame. She stared at the ceiling and thought about a word in her language that did not translate well into Galactic Common. The closest approximation was the fear that comes from realizing you have been standing on something alive. A transmission arrived in the Concord's central communication hub at the bottom of the hour. It came from the Terran outer boundary, flagged with Admiral Sunwoo's clearance codes. Several delegates expected a threat. A show of force, warships moving into position. It was a logistics manifest. Supply line alternatives, trade route redirections, self-sufficient infrastructure grids for every human colony in the outer territories, agricultural independence projections, energy self-sufficiency timelines, medical production schedules. No threats, no demands, no warships. Just a species showing the galaxy, calmly and completely, that it did not need them. Fenris read the manifest in his quarters. He read it twice. Then he set the datapad down and stared at the wall for a very long time. He understood strength measured in ships and teeth, and willingness to bleed. This was something else. This was a species that had spent 40 years building a door that nobody else could see, and now they were walking through it. And the rest of the galaxy was standing in a room that was getting colder by the minute. He did not laugh again that night. By the 3rd day, the galaxy started to feel it. Not in the grand corridors of the Concord station, not in the speeches or the emergency sessions, or the frantic diplomatic messages bouncing between 100 star systems. Those were noise. The real damage was quieter, smaller. The kind of thing you only notice when it stops. A medical shipment bound for the Ruvani homeworld was delayed. Not cancelled. The humans had not cancelled anything. They had simply stopped prioritizing it. The shipment carried a synthetic protein compound used in Ruvani pediatric care. Only 2 facilities in the galaxy produced it. Both were on human colonies. The delay was 4 days. 4 days meant nothing in the grand sweep of galactic politics. It meant everything to the Ruvani medical officer who had to call the families and explain why treatment was being postponed. Ulvarik heard about the delay and said nothing. He had 4 eyes, and all of them were pointed at the same realization. In her observation gallery, Lysic worked without sleeping. Gathani did not require sleep the way other species did. They entered a low power state for a few hours every 3 days. But even by her species standards, she was pushing herself. Her report had grown from a simple dependency analysis into something that felt increasingly like an autopsy of a system that was still alive, but losing blood. She called it the human thread. It was not a dramatic name. Gathani did not do dramatic, but the data was dramatic enough. Humans maintained 63% of the Concorde's deep space navigation beacons, not because they were assigned to, because no one else had volunteered, and the beacons needed maintaining, and humans had a species-wide compulsion to fix things that were broken. It was, Lysick noted, the most dangerous form of generosity, the kind that made everyone else forget how to do the job themselves. Humans ran the biotech patents that fed the agricultural systems of 12 member species. Not because they had conquered those systems, because human scientists had solved the soil compatibility problems 30 years ago, and had licensed the solutions at rates so low that it was cheaper for other species to use human biotech than to develop their own. It was not a trap. That was the terrifying part. It had never been a trap. It was just humans being useful, decade after decade, until usefulness became dependency, and dependency became invisible. Lysick added a line to her report that she knew would be quoted for centuries. They did not build a cage. They built a house. We forgot it was theirs. On day 3, 3 minor species, the Pelori, the Gathani themselves, and the small but wealthy Durrani collective, formally petitioned the Concorde for permission to negotiate bilateral treaties with Earth outside the Concorde framework. Thuron attempted to block the petitions. He cited precedent, protocol, and the importance of unified Concorde action. Ulrich listened with the patience of a species that measures time in geological periods, and then informed Thuron that no mechanism existed within the Concorde Charter to prevent sovereign species from engaging in external diplomacy. The Charter had never needed such a mechanism. No one had ever wanted to negotiate outside the Concorde before. The Concorde was the table. Why would anyone eat on the floor? Unless the table was rotten. Thuron felt the ground shifting. His coalition, carefully assembled over months of promises and pressure, developed cracks. 2 of his strongest supporters, the Valmari Technocracy and the Ossic Trade Federation, quietly opened back channels to the human delegation. They did not tell Thuron. They did not need to. Hana knew they would come. She had their communication frequencies preloaded on a secure channel before the walkout. She recorded every conversation, smiled at her screen, filed them in a folder she had labeled with the dry humor of a woman who planned the way other people breathed. Predictable. Tejo, meanwhile, accepted a private meeting with Fenris. It took place in a neutral conference room on the station's outer ring. The room was bare, a table, 2 chairs, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly worse than they actually were. Fenris entered first. He stood, because Kaldrathi did not sit before an adversary. Then he reconsidered and sat down, and the act of sitting cost him something that showed in the set of his jaw. Tejo arrived 2 minutes later. He carried nothing. No datapad, no folder. He sat across from Fenris and folded his hands on the table and waited. The silence between them was a living thing. It had weight and teeth, and both of them could feel it, pressing on the walls. Fenris spoke first. His translator rendered the words into clean English, but Mireille, who was monitoring the audio feed from the next room, could hear the raw Kaldrathi beneath it. And the original was rougher, more guttural, stripped of the politeness the software imposed. "We measured you wrong," Fenris said. Tejo's expression did not change. "You measured what we showed you." Fenris let this settle. His claws tapped the table once, a rhythmic tick that in Kaldrathi culture signaled the processing of new information. The fleet repositioned before the vote. It did. Admiral Sunwoo, I have studied his record. He does not reposition for exercises. No, he does not. How long? It was not a question. Fenris did not phrase it as a question because the answer frightened him, and asking for it as a question would mean admitting that he needed it. Tejo looked at Fenris. For a moment, the agreeable mask slipped, not into anger, not into triumph, but into something older and more tired, the face of a man who had spent decades being underestimated, and had made a weapon of it, but was not, in his private heart, grateful for the necessity. Long enough, Tejo said. The meeting lasted 8 minutes. Neither party released a statement. That evening, Mireille sat alone in the delegation's communication room and monitored traffic from Earth. It was part of her job, tracking public sentiment, flagging potential security concerns, maintaining the link between what was happening at the summit and what 9 billion people on Earth knew about it. They knew almost nothing. A mother in Busan was asking about a shipping delay. Her daughter's school supplies were on a freighter that had been rerouted. A university in Daejeon was requesting a timeline extension on a joint research project with Gatheni biologists. A cargo pilot named Cho Eun-ji had filed a complaint about new routing protocols that added 6 hours to her supply run. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, filing ordinary complaints about inconveniences they did not understand. Mireille stared at the screen and felt the distance between this room and that world like a physical gap in her chest. These people, the mother, the researcher, the cargo pilot, they were the reason the galaxy was panicking, not the fleet, not the empty chairs in the Concorde chamber. These people, their work, their freight, their biotech, their navigation beacons and synthetic proteins and soil compatibility patents. The invisible labor of a species that fixed things because they were broken and did not think to ask for credit. She thought about something Hana had said on the shuttle, a throwaway line that Mireille had not understood at the time. Our leverage was never the fleet, it was the freight. She understood now. In the station's gymnasium, 3 levels below the diplomatic wing, Do-hyun hid a heavy bag with the methodical patience of a man who was not angry but who needed his hands to be busy. The bag was designed for species twice his weight. He hit it anyway. Each strike was clean, precise, and carried the particular sound of someone who had been hitting things for a very long time and had found something like peace in the rhythm. A Kaldrathi warrior passed the open doorway. He was young, broad, built for combat in the way all Kaldrathi were built for combat. He stopped, watched Do-hyun's hands, watched the way the bag moved, not swinging wildly, but absorbing, compressing, barely shifting. The Kaldrathi stood there for 10 seconds. Then he walked away without entering. Some measurements do not require conversation. The anomaly appeared on the long-range sensors at 0347 station time on the 6th day. And for a few hours, the walkout stopped being the most important thing in the galaxy. It came from the deep black, the region beyond the Concorde's mapped territories, where stars thinned out and the void between them grew wide enough to swallow meaning. The sensors flagged it as a gravitational disturbance first, then an energy signature, then something the classification systems had no category for. So they simply labeled it unknown priority and routed it to every command channel simultaneously. Lissik was the first civilian analyst to see the data. She recognized it. Not the anomaly itself, no one had seen it move before, but the energy signature matched records from 40 years ago. Deep space survey data, collected by a joint Concorde expedition. The expedition's chief scientist had been human, Dr. Shin Yujin, a woman whose name appeared in exactly 1 footnote in the official Concorde archive, and who had, upon reviewing her findings, written a single recommendation. Build a response fleet, position it at the outer boundary, and pray you never need it. The Concorde had built the fleet, 32 ships from 9 species, designed to operate as a unified rapid response force against deep space threats that defied standard classification. The fleet's tactical protocols were written by human strategists. Its navigation systems ran on human-designed software. Its supply lines were routed through, Lysick did not even need to check, human logistics networks. She closed her eyes, opened them. The numbers had not changed. Ulrich convened an emergency session within the hour. The chamber was full, but the energy was different from the first day. The political maneuvering was gone. The posturing was gone. What remained was something raw and simple. The kind of fear that strips language down to its bones. The anomaly is moving toward inhabited space, Ulrich said. He did not dress it in diplomatic language. There was no time. Current projections place it within range of the Pylori outer colonies in 97 cycles. The Joint Response Fleet is our primary countermeasure. He paused. Every compound eye focused on the chamber floor. The fleet cannot operate without its full support infrastructure. No one said the word human. No one needed to. The empty chairs across the chamber said it louder than any voice could. Theron stood. His scales were pale, stress coloring, visible to every species in the room. The fleet is a Concord asset, he said. It operates under Concord command. Human participation is not required. Ulrich turned two eyes toward Theron with the slow, heavy patience of a teacher who has heard this answer before and found it wanting every time. The fleet's navigation core runs on human proprietary software. Its supply chain requires 17 human-operated relay stations. The tactical protocols assume human ship integration at 40% of fleet capacity. Without these elements, the fleet operates at an estimated 31% effectiveness. 31%. The number landed in the chamber and sat there, ugly and immovable. Fenris rose. Every eye, compound, singular, multispectral, turned to the Kaldrathi delegate. He was not a diplomat by nature. He was a soldier who had been given a diplomat's chair because his people respected directness and distrusted anyone who was good at talking. He looked at Thurin the way a predator looks at something it has decided is not worth eating. You wish to take their resources by force, Fenris said. It was not a question. He had read Thurin's posture, his scale coloring, the angle of his tail. Kaldrathi were built to read bodies the way Gathani were built to read data. You wish to seize their ships, their software, their supply stations, and compel their engineers to serve. Theron said nothing. His silence confirmed everything. Fenris showed his teeth. Not amusement this time. Something colder. You wish to steal from the species that planned for this moment a decade before we noticed it was coming. You are not brave, emissary. You are blind. The chamber held its breath. Fenris sat down. Theron remained standing for 3 more seconds, long enough for the silence to become a verdict, and then sat as well. His tail was perfectly still. Among his species, a still tail meant that the body had run out of things to say. The emergency summons reached the human delegation's quarters 12 minutes later. Taeho read it at the table in the small room. Hana read it over his shoulder. Do-yun stood by the door, arms crossed, reading nothing, because reading was not his function in this room. Hana spoke first. We let them sweat for another cycle. The anomaly is 97 cycles out. There is no urgency that serves their timeline more than ours. Taeho looked at the datapad. The summons was formal, polite, and carried the unmistakable scent of desperation in its precisely worded request for collaborative consultation regarding mutual security interests. No, he said. Hana's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes recalculated. Ambassador. We did not leave to watch them burn. He set the datapad down. We left so they would understand the fire. The distinction mattered. Hana knew it mattered. She had built the strategy, but Taeho had built the principle beneath it. And the principle was this. Power that is used to punish is just cruelty with better funding. Power that is used to clarify, to force a reckoning that leads to restructuring. That was something worth the cost. She nodded once. Disagreed internally. filed the disagreement for future reference, opened a new channel on her datapad. They sent Mireille. It was deliberate. Every piece of this was deliberate. Sending the most junior member of the delegation said two things at once. This is not a return, and the door is open. A senior diplomat would signal capitulation. An empty chair would signal refusal. Mireille, young, earnest, visibly nervous, signaled possibility. She walked into the chamber alone. Every eye turned. Every delegate leaned forward by some fraction of a degree, drawn by the gravity of a single human woman carrying a datapad and wearing an expression that could not decide between terror and determination, and had settled on both. Mireille stood at the podium that Thuron had used to propose the resolution that started all of this. The podium was too tall for her. She had to adjust the height mechanism, and it made a grinding sound that echoed through the silent chamber. And she thought she might actually die of embarrassment right there on the floor of the Galactic Concorde, killed not by an alien threat, but by a malfunctioning lectern. She cleared her throat. The Terran delegation acknowledges the Concorde's request for collaborative consultation, she said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how. Her hands were not steady. She pressed them flat against the podium and let the cold surface anger her. Ambassador Kang, Taeho, has authorized me to present the following framework for re-engagement. She activated her datapad. The terms projected onto the chamber's central display, a holographic field large enough for every species to read in their native script. They were not demands. The language was careful, respectful, and constructed with the precision of a clockmaker who had been given 2 years to build a single mechanism. Full sovereignty for all human outer colonies. Restructured voting weight in the Concorde Assembly, proportional to contribution rather than seniority. Formal recognition of human infrastructure contributions, retroactively applied to the past 4 decades. A permanent human seat on the Joint Security Council. Independent oversight of any resolution affecting human territories. Not demands, conditions. The difference was a scalpel. Lysick read the terms from her gallery. She read them twice. Then she turned to the Gathany aide beside her and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "They wrote these before they came to the summit." Her aide blinked. "How do you know?" "Because the formatting references charter provisions that were amended 6 months ago. The legal citations are current to the day they departed Earth." Lysick's hands were still. They had stopped trembling. What replaced the trembling was something worse, the calm that comes from understanding a thing completely. They did not react to Thuron's resolution. Thuron's resolution reacted to them. They knew what he would propose. They came here to let him propose it. The walkout was not a response. It was a trigger. She looked at the empty human chairs across the chamber. Small chairs, placed further from the center. Designed to make the people sitting in them shift and fidget and never quite settle. Everything, she said quietly, was the plan. Below her, in the chamber, Mireille stood at the podium and waited. She did not fidget. She did not shift. Her hands were flat on the surface, and her chin was level, and she was 28 years old, and she was not afraid. That was a lie. She was terrified. But she stood anyway, and the galaxy watched. The vote took 2 days. Not because the terms were complicated. They were, in fact, remarkably clear. Hana had written them with the kind of precision that left no room for creative interpretation. No shadows for lesser diplomats to hide loopholes inside. The 2 days were not about understanding. They were about pride. About 600 species coming to terms with the fact that the galaxy's filing clerks had just rewritten the filing system, and every signature on the old documents was suddenly worth less than the paper it was printed on. Taeho returned to the chamber on the 8th day. He walked in the same way he had walked out, unhurried, jacket buttoned, hands empty. Hana was beside him. Mireille, who had spent the previous 2 days standing at that podium, answering questions from delegates who had never spoken to a human directly before, fell into step beside them with the quiet relief of someone who had been holding a door open and was grateful to finally see people walk through it. The chamber was full, every seat occupied, every translator running. Tejo sat in his small chair. He did not comment on it. He did not need to. Everyone in the room was looking at that chair and seeing it for the first time. The debate was long. Theron fought. He fought with rhetoric, with procedural challenges, with every tool the Concord's 600-year bureaucracy had ever produced. He was one of the finest political operators his species had produced in a generation, and he deployed every skill he had with the focused intensity of a man defending not a resolution, but a version of the galaxy in which he still mattered. It was not enough. His coalition crumbled in stages. The Velmari technocracy abstained first, a polite withdrawal that said, "We have made other arrangements," without saying it aloud. The Ossic Trade Federation followed. Then, the Durrani. Then, in a move that made Thuron's scales go white from jaw to tail, his own deputy announced that the Valeth Dominion's outer territories had independently petitioned for bilateral trade agreements with Earth. Thuron voted against the resolution. His was one of 11 opposing votes out of 614. The number would be recorded in the Concord archive. Lysic made sure of that. The resolution passed. Human colonies retained full sovereignty. Voting weight was restructured. A contribution-based credit system was established. Species that maintained infrastructure received proportional representation in Concord decision-making. It was the most significant reform in the Concord's history. And it was accomplished not through war or threats or the movement of warships, but through the simple, devastating act of a species that stopped showing up and let the galaxy feel what its absence meant. After the vote, the chamber emptied slowly. Delegates lingered in small groups, talking in low voices, recalibrating alliances and assumptions. Theron did not linger. He did not leave either. He sat in his seat and stared at the central podium where Mire had stood, where his resolution had been projected, where the galaxy had quietly and firmly told him no. His chair was large, comfortable, positioned near the center of the chamber, where the acoustics were best and the sightlines most commanding. He had never thought about his chair before. He was thinking about it now. Fenris found Dohyan in the corridor outside the chamber. The Kaldrathi was alone, which was unusual. His species moved in groups, a holdover from pack-hunting ancestors who had never fully trusted the concept of solitude. Dohyan was also alone, which was not unusual at all. They stood 3 meters apart. The corridor was empty. The lighting was the pale blue-white that the station used during transition periods, and it made both of them look like something carved from stone. Fenris raised his right fist and pressed it against his own throat. Among his species, this gesture was reserved for warriors who had faced each other in combat and found the other worthy. It had not been offered to a non-Kaldrathi in over 200 years. The last time it was offered, the recipient had been a Ruvani general who had held a mountain pass against an army for 11 days. Dohyan looked at Fenris. His face was the same wall it had always been, stone and silence, and the particular stillness of a man who communicated through presence rather than language. He raised his own fist, pressed it against his throat. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The gesture was a sentence. The return was a paragraph. The silence between them was the rest of the story. In the observation gallery, Lysic finalized her report. It ran to 400 pages in standard Gathani academic format. She would spend the next year condensing it, annotating it, defending it before review boards who would question her conclusions and her methodology, and her species' famous neutrality. She did not care. The report said what the data said, and the data said this. Humanity had not won a political victory. Humanity had revealed a structural truth that the galaxy had been too comfortable to examine. She titled the report, "The Weight of the Quiet Hand," and added a dedication that read, simply, "For the cargo pilots." Ulvarek requested a private meeting with Tejo on the final evening. It took place in Ulvarek's personal quarters, a rare honor, extended to fewer than a dozen individuals in the speaker's 90-year tenure. The room was warm, humid, and smelled like the moss that Ruvani cultivated for comfort, the way humans kept photographs. The furniture was designed for an insectoid body. Tejo sat on a bench that forced his knees up to his chest and said nothing about it. Ulvarek poured a drink. It was a Ruvani ceremonial liquid, thick, amber, and slightly alive. He offered a cup to Tejo. Tejo accepted it and held it without drinking, because he had been briefed on Ruvani customs and knew that the offering mattered more than the consumption. "How long were you planning this?" Ulvarek asked. Tejo looked at the cup in his hands. The liquid moved on its own, a slow circular current that the Ruvani found meditative and that Tejo found mildly unsettling, though he would never say so. "Since the day you made our chairs smaller," he said. Ulvarek was still for a long time. His species processed significant information through stillness, a full-body pause that allowed every neural pathway to engage simultaneously. When he moved again, it was slow, and something in the way he held his forearms had changed. "I did not make the chairs," he said. "No," Tejo agreed, "but you sat in this chamber for 90 years and never noticed." Ulvarek had no response to this. It was not an accusation. It was a fact, delivered without anger, and facts without anger are the hardest things in the universe to argue with. Hana spent the last evening on the station doing what Hana always did, preparing. The walkout was finished. The resolution was passed. The chairs would be resized, and Hana was already building the next 10 years in her head, mapping alliances and pressure points and the slow, inevitable recalibration of a galaxy that had just learned something it could not unlearn. She found Mireille in the communication room, staring at a blank screen. "The hard part starts now," Hana said. She leaned against the doorframe. Her arms were crossed. Her datapad was in her pocket. For the first time since Mireille had known her, Hana looked like a person instead of a strategy. "What do you mean?" Mireille asked. "Walking out is easy. Staying at the table, the new table, the one where they actually see you, that is where it gets hard. Because now they will watch everything we do, every decision, every shipment, every vote. Walking out made us visible. Staying visible is the real work." Mireille nodded. She did not fully understand. She suspected she would understand in a year, or 5, or 20, the way she always understood things Hana said. Slowly, and then all at once, and usually at 3 in the morning. On the last morning, Mireille walked through the chamber alone. It was empty. The seats were bare. The holographic displays were dark. The cleaning systems hummed overhead, scrubbing the air of 600 species biochemistry, reducing the room to nothing. The human chairs were still there, the small ones, placed further from the center. The new ones had been ordered, standard size, repositioned, but they would not arrive for another week. For now, the old chairs remained, and Mireille stood in front of one and rested her hand on its back. She thought about the mother in Busan, asking about a shipping delay. The university researcher in Daejeon. Cho Eunji, the cargo pilot, filing her complaint about routing protocols. People who built things and fixed things and carried things across distances that the mind could not hold. And who did it without ever sitting in this room. She thought about Tejo's hands, folded and still, carrying the weight of 40 years of small chairs and smaller words. She thought about Hana's smile, the one that meant she had already seen the ending. She thought about Da-hyun's silence, which was not empty, but full, packed tight with everything he chose not to say, because saying it would have made it smaller. She thought about Fenris pressing his fist to his throat. She thought about Lysic's trembling hands going still. She thought about Theron, alone in a big chair, realizing for the first time that size is not the same as importance. Mireille lifted her hand from the chair. She turned toward the exit. The corridor beyond was long and curved, lit by bioluminescent panels that cast a soft, steady glow across the walls. The panels had been designed and installed by human engineers 30 years ago. They were part of the station-wide lighting overhaul that had won an efficiency award from the Concorde's Infrastructure Committee. The award was a small plaque in a hallway no one visited. The engineers' names were not on it. She would fix that, she decided. Not today, but she would fix it. She walked the corridor the same way her delegation had walked out, unhurried, deliberate, and aware that every species in the building was watching. Her footsteps echoed. She did not make them quieter,